Have you ever met a woman who seems like she can handle everything? She knows how to take care of everybody. She knows how to solve problems. She knows how to keep the peace. She knows how to make sure everybody is okay. She rarely asks for help. And even when she's completely exhausted, she'll still find a way to show up for everybody else. People might look at her and say she's just so mature. They love to use this word mature. She's so responsible. She's always been an old soul. Oh my gosh, I used to hear that a lot. I'm an old soul. I'm mature for my age. But sometimes what people call maturity is actually a little girl who learned very early that she couldn't afford to be a child. And that brings me to the parentified daughter. Because there are a lot of women walking around today who don't realize that they were parentified. They just know that they grew up feeling responsible for everybody. They know they had to grow up fast. They know they couldn't really fall apart because somebody else was always falling apart. And they may have spent their entire adult lives wondering why they are so exhausted, why they have such a hard time saying no, why they feel guilty when they're not helping somebody, or why they somehow keep ending up in relationships where everybody needs something from them. So, let's talk about what a parentified daughter actually is, what this can look like, and why it can follow a woman well into adulthood. First, let's define parentification. Parentification is essentially a role reversal. Instead of the parent consistently being the adult and the child being allowed to be the child begins taking on responsibilities that are supposed to belong to the parent. And there are different forms of this. Sometimes it's very practical. Maybe you were responsible for getting your younger siblings ready, cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, getting them to school, making sure they ate, watching them while your parent worked, handling things around the house that were simply too much responsibility for a child. And sometimes it is emotional. This one can be harder to recognize because maybe your mother treated you like her best friend. Maybe you knew all about her relationship problems, her financial problems, her arguments with your father, her emotional struggles. You were the person she cried to, the person she vented to, the person she expected to understand, the person who had to calm her down. And you may have learned that your job wasn't just to be a daughter, your job was to keep your parent emotionally okay. That's parentification. And here's something important. A child helping around the house is not automatically parentification. A child taking on age appropriate responsibility isn't automatically being parentified. Children should learn responsibility. Children can help with siblings. Children can have chores. Children can contribute to the household where they live. The problem is when the responsibility becomes excessive, chronic, developmentally inappropriate, or comes at the expense of the child's own emotional and developmental needs. And this is where a lot of daughters start recognizing themselves. Because maybe nobody ever sat you down and said, you are now responsible for this family. It was much more subtle. You just noticed that when something went wrong, everybody looked at you. You became the dependable one, the mature one, the responsible one. You became the one who could handle it. I'm using air quotes. You could handle it. And eventually you internalized that role. You learned I have to be responsible. I can't make things harder. I need to keep everybody happy. I need to take care of mom. I need to protect my siblings. I need to be the good daughter. And eventually, you stopped asking yourself what you needed because everybody else's needs were louder. And this is one of the biggest things I want women to understand about parentification. You can become extremely good at taking care of people while becoming completely disconnected from yourself. Because when you're constantly monitoring everybody else's emotions, you don't have much room left to pay attention to your own. You become hyper aware. You can walk into a room and immediately sense somebody is upset. You know when someone's tone changes. You know when somebody is angry. You know when somebody is disappointed. You know when there's tension. And therefore, before anybody even asks you for something, you're already trying to figure out how to fix it because that's what you learned to do. You learned that peace in the household depended on you being aware. You learned that somebody else's emotional state could become your responsibility. So now you're an adult and somebody is upset with you. And instead of thinking that's their emotion, they'll have to work through it. You're immediately jumping into what did I do? How can I fix this? Are they mad at me? What can I do to make this better? That's exhausting. And it can follow you directly into romantic relationships. Because if you grew up believing that love means taking care of somebody, you may accidentally confuse being needed with being loved. You may gravitate toward people who constantly need something from you, someone who needs emotional support, someone who needs rescuing, someone who needs you to organize their life, someone who can't regulate themselves, someone who expects you to carry the emotional labor of the relationship. And because you're used to it, you may not immediately recognize it as unhealthy. You may actually feel useful. You may think, at least I'm needed. But being needed is not the same thing as being loved or valued. And being useful is not the same thing as being valued. That's a very important distinction for the parentified daughter. Because one of the hardest things about healing from parentification is learning that you don't have to earn your place in somebody's lives through what you do for them. You don't have to constantly provide. You don't have to constantly fix. You don't have to constantly sacrifice. You don't have to be the strongest person in the room. And you definitely don't have to be everybody's emergency contact emotionally. Another thing that can happen is that parentified daughters become incredibly self sufficient. And on the surface, that sounds like a good thing. You can handle your business and you don't need anybody. You know how to figure things out. You know how to survive. But sometimes extreme independence isn't just independence. Sometimes it's a survival strategy. It's if I don't depend on anybody, nobody can disappoint me. If I handle everything myself, nobody can let me down. If I don't need anything, nobody can tell me I'm asking for too much. So you become the woman who says, I'm good, I got it, don't worry about it, even when you desperately need the support. And you can end up resenting people because nobody helps you, but you never actually allowed yourself to need them. You were so conditioned to be the giver that receiving can feel uncomfortable. And that is another part of the healing process. Learning how to receive, learning how to ask, learning how to say, I need help, learning how to let another adult carry something without feeling immediately guilty because you are allowed to have needs, you are allowed to be cared for, you are allowed to be the one who doesn't know what to do. You are allowed to have a bad day. You are allowed to disappoint people. Yes, you. And you're allowed to have a life that is organized around keeping everybody comfortable. And I also want to talk about the daughters specifically because girls are often socialized to be caregivers. They're often expected to be more responsible, more emotionally aware, more helpful, and more nurturing. And in some families, the oldest daughter can become the unofficial second parent. Not every oldest daughter is parentified, and not every parentified child is a daughter. But there are very real family and cultural expectations that can make daughters especially vulnerable to being placed into caregiving roles. And sometimes the family doesn't even recognize what they're doing. They might say, she's just mature. She can handle it. She knows better. She helps me so much. She's my right hand. And that little girl may even be praised for sacrificing herself. That's what makes it complicated because she isn't necessarily being screamed at. Nobody necessarily tells her she's worthless. She might actually receive praise, but the praise is attached to her ability to carry things that shouldn't have been hers to carry. So she learns, I get love when I'm useful. Imagine that little 10-year-old girl getting praised for doing something. I get approval when I'm responsible. I get praised when I don't need anything. And eventually, being taken care of can start to feel foreign. Now, I want to be very clear about something. Understanding parentification doesn't mean you have to spend your entire adulthood blaming your parents for everything. Families can go through difficult circumstances, poverty, illness, divorce, loss, single parenting. A parent may genuinely be struggling and still unintentionally place too much responsibility on a child. Parentification isn't always malicious or intentional, but lack of malicious intent doesn't mean the experience had no impact. Both things can be true. You can understand why your parent struggled, and you can still acknowledge that you were asked to carry too much. You can love your family and still recognize that certain family dynamics weren't healthy for you. You can appreciate everything your parents did provide and still say, I shouldn't have had to become the adult in the room. That's not disrespect. That is honesty. And the reason this conversation matters is because research continues to connect parentification with emotional distress, difficulties in family relationships, identity development issues, and challenges in adult relationships. A 2026 systematic review examining 69 studies identified psychological and emotional distress, strained family relationships, identity formation, well being, risky behaviors, and cultural influences among major themes associated with parentification. So if you're a woman watching this and you're realizing, wait a minute, maybe you've always been the responsible one. Maybe you feel guilty for resting. Maybe you feel guilty saying no. Maybe you automatically take care of everybody. Maybe you struggle to receive. Maybe you constantly feel like something is your responsibility when it really isn't. Maybe you're attracted to people who need fixing. Maybe you're uncomfortable when nobody needs anything from you. Maybe you don't even know what you want because you spent so much of your life figuring out what everybody else wants. That doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It may mean you need to learn you it may mean that you learned a role very early in life. And now you're at the point where you have to decide whether you want to keep playing it, because adulthood is where you get to start separating your identity from your survival role. You can be a daughter without being your mother's therapist. You can be a sister without being your sibling's second mother. You can be a partner without becoming somebody's caretaker. You can be a friend without becoming everyone's crisis manager. And you can be a woman who has needs without feeling ashamed of having them. That is part of growing into yourself. So if you see yourself in the parentified daughter, I want you to really sit with this. You were a child. You were supposed to have adults. You were supposed to have somewhere to put your problems. You were supposed to have someone checking on you. You were supposed to be allowed to make mistakes. You were supposed to have space to figure out who you were. And if you didn't get all of that, you don't have to spend the rest of your life proving how capable you are. You don't have to keep carrying everybody just because you've always carried everybody. You don't have to keep being the strong one. You don't have to keep earning love through labor. And you don't have to feel guilty because you're finally choosing yourself. Sometimes healing looks like becoming stronger and more like finally realizing I don't have to be strong all the time. I misspoke. Sometimes healing looks less like becoming stronger and more like finally realizing I don't have to be strong all the time. You can put the responsibility down, honey. Put it down. Bag lady, you gon' hurt your back. You can let grown people handle their own lives. You can learn to receive. You can learn to rest. You can learn to say no. You can learn you can learn what you actually like, what you actually want, and what kind of life you want to build when your entire existence isn't centered around taking care of everybody else. Because you deserve to experience womanhood as more than an extension of the childhood responsibilities you were handed. And if this video made something click for you, don't just sit with that realization. You need to start paying attention. Pay attention to where you feel responsible for things that aren't yours. Pay attention to where guilt shows up when you choose yourself. Pay attention to the relationships where you're always the giver. And most importantly, start asking yourself a question that you may not have been allowed to ask when you were younger. What do I want? Not what my family needs, not what will make everybody happy, not what will keep the peace, not what will make everything easier for everybody else. What do I want? Because that little girl who had to grow up too soon deserves to meet the woman who finally gets to live for herself. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and share this with another woman who might need to hear it, because I know we all know somebody. This is Pretty Girl Rich Era, where we heal, level up, and become the best version of ourselves. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, loves.